Hi, welcome back to Reflections, everyone, where we talk about all things Church of Christ with the Elijah Message. It is wonderful to be back with you, spending this time together. So we've been talking a little bit about Joseph Smith. And what's interesting is that there's a difference between the Eastern Latter-day Saint tradition and the Western Latter-day Saint tradition. So the Western tradition would be the people that went out to Utah, like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, the Mormon fundamentalists, the people who believe that polygamy should still be taught and practiced in the church. And the Eastern traditions, like Community of Christ, the Church of Christ Temple Lot, the Church of Jesus Christ Bickertonite, the Church of Christ with the Elijah Message. And the difference between the understanding of Joseph Smith in these traditions is that the Western traditions emphasize him as a person and the work that he was called to do. So there is a little bit more reverence for him, a little importance of him as a prophet, seer, and revelator in the church. In the Eastern traditions, there's a larger emphasis on the work that he was called to do, but not really him as a person. And so you have people who believe Joseph Smith was a prophet and who will talk about him. And you have people who won't even say his name. So when they talk about the Book of Mormon, or the Record of the Nephites as we call it, they'll say, the guy that translated or the guy that wrote it, they won't even give him an identity marker. It's really interesting. But nonetheless, all of these churches in the Latter-day Saint tradition have to ask themselves a question. How much of the legacy of Joseph Smith do you want to include in your church tradition? And so we have his calling to bring forth the Record of the Nephites. And as he was doing this and establishing the Church of Christ and the Restoration, he was receiving revelations and prophecies and visions. And they were collected, and eventually they were published, first as the Book of Commandments, and then edited and expanded in the Doctrine and Covenants. And then he was called, he believes, to do a revision and expansion of the Bible, the inspired version of the Holy Scriptures, or the Joseph Smith translation, what he called the New Translation. But at the same time, he was working on other projects, like the Book of Abraham, and writing a history of the church. And, in the history of the church, that's where a lot of the Doctrine and Covenant sections that are in the Utah church that are not in the Eastern church, like Community of Christ, come from, that writing. And so the question, how much of this writing do you include in your tradition, and what do you do with the others? Are they false revelations, false prophecies, false writings, false revelations? And at the same time, you have the person of Joseph Smith as well. He was practicing polygamy, and he was lying about doing it. And he was the general of the Nauvoo Legion. There's that famous story of him liking to sit on his horse, Charlie, in his uniform. He was the mayor of Nauvoo. He ran for president, a member of the Reform Party. He was known for having a short temper. He was a beer drinker. And then you have Joseph Smith's theological interpretations. So he becomes a Freemason in 1842, and a lot of the early Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo were Freemasons. And so you have these Masonic temple rituals that are in the temple. And you have this idea that Heavenly Father is a being of flesh and bone, like in the Utah's Doctrine and Covenants, section 130. And then, well, what comes out of that? And some have said that Joseph Smith taught this to them, and maybe he did, we don't know. But then we have a heavenly mother, or mothers, if polygamy is necessary for the highest degree of celestial glory. So the question is, like, what do we do with all this? And I think in the Elijah message tradition, we have just focused really on the scriptures. We have focused on the Bible. And the Bible of the Latter-day Saint tradition is the King James Bible. We've focused on the record of the Nephites. And then we have our own scriptures. And we say that these are the most reliable. You know, even though in the Elijah message tradition, there are people that are very kind of Latter-day Saint, and they like the Doctrine and Covenants, and they like the inspired version, and they like the Book of Abraham, and they get something out of, some spiritual nourishment out of it, even though that the church itself doesn't recognize these things as authoritative. And so that's kind of interesting that we have these decisions to make sometimes, not just as church traditions, but as individuals as well. And, you know, just personally, I like having it all. You know, I like getting spiritual nourishment, as you know, as we have talked about the inspired version of the Holy Scriptures and the Doctrine and Covenants, particularly the Eastern Doctrine and Covenants. You know, the Eastern Church has a tendency just to accept the Doctrine and Covenants sections that were either published in Joseph Smith's lifetime or were going to be published, at least by 1844 when he died. And maybe we'll talk about the Book of Abraham. It's a fascinating book, I don't know. But it is something interesting to think about, you know, the Joseph Smith saga. That is just an inevitable part of the restoration. My brothers and sisters, it's been wonderful spending this time with you, thinking about these things, reflecting upon them. And until next time, I invite you into the Elijah Message House.